In the vast, sun-scorched heart of Western Australia, there are spaces on the map marked simply as unexplored. These are not gentle voids, but immense territories of rock, sand, and spinifex, governed by a silence so profound it feels like a physical presence. It was in one of these voids, 100 kilometers from the nearest track, that a government drone captured an image that should not have existed. A faint, geometric anomaly amidst the chaos of the natural landscape. It was the first thread pulled from a tapestry of human history so dark and tangled, it would challenge our very understanding of family, survival, and secrecy. What authorities would eventually uncover there, in a place forgotten by time, was not just a family, but a closed system. A human ecosystem that had turned inward for over a century. They found a bloodline so concentrated that the family tree had ceased to be a tree at all. It had become a circle. The story of the Colt family is not one of adventure or pioneering spirit. It is a chilling case study in the consequences of absolute isolation. It begins not with malice, but with a fanatical and paranoid vision of purity. In 1889, Jedediah Colt, a prospector and self-styled prophet fleeing the perceived sin of the burgeoning coastal settlements, ventured into the Outback with his wife, 2 sons, and a daughter. He was not looking for gold, but for God's anvil, a place so harsh and remote it could forge a new, uncorrupted lineage for humanity. He found it in a shallow, defensible basin, fed by a weak but persistent underground spring. There, he declared the world outside dead to them, a Sodom and Gomorrah, from which they were the only righteous escapees. He laid down the law that would become their gospel and their curse, the Colt Covenant. The covenant was simple and absolute. Its first tenet was separation. No one would leave the basin, and no outsider would ever be allowed to enter. Their small world was to be the entirety of existence. The second tenet was purity. The Colt bloodline, he preached, was sacred, a direct inheritance from a nobler time. To mix it with the tainted blood of the outside world was the ultimate blasphemy. Therefore, the family would propagate from within. Sons would take daughters, brothers would take sisters, and the line would continue, clean and unbroken. Jedediah, a man of iron will and terrifying conviction, enforced these rules with the authority of a deity. He was the law, the word, and the architect of a generational tragedy. In this scorched cradle of isolation, the Colts began their long, slow descent into a genetic twilight. For over 120 years, they remained ghosts. The world outside fought wars, built cities, and connected continents with invisible waves of information. But in the Colt Basin, time moved differently. It was measured in seasons of brutal heat, in the birth of a new child, and in the quiet burials of those who were born too different to survive. They were expert survivors, mastering the unforgiving landscape. They hunted, they foraged, and they maintained a fragile existence on the very edge of possibility. But with each passing generation, the consequences of Jedediah's covenant became etched into their very bodies. The sacred bloodline he sought to preserve was, in fact, slowly destroying them. The outside world finally intruded in 2014. Sarah Jenkins was a cartographer with a geomatics firm contracted by the state government. Her job was to create high-resolution topological maps for a proposed mining exploration zone. For weeks, her drones had scanned nothing but endless, monotonous terrain. Then, the anomaly appeared on her screen. A cluster of structures, arranged in a rough circle. They were crude, built from rock, scavenged timber, and corrugated iron, but they were undeniably man-made. There were no records of any settlement, past or present, in this quadrant. No homesteads, no abandoned mining camps, nothing. Intrigued and obligated to investigate any unrecorded habitation, she chartered a helicopter. The landing of the aircraft was an apocalyptic event for the inhabitants of the basin. As Sarah and her pilot stepped out, they were met by a silent, staring group of about 20 people. Her first impression was one of profound poverty and neglect. But as she looked closer, a deeper, more unsettling feeling took hold. There was a strange uniformity to their features. Many had the same wide-set eyes, the same low-set ears, the same slight droop to one side of their mouths. She saw a young woman with fingers that were fused together, a condition known as syndactyly. An older man had a visible cleft palate, crudely repaired by scar tissue. A child, no older than 5, stared at her with a vacant expression, his head noticeably misshapen. A tall, gaunt man with a wild gray beard and the same piercing eyes as the others stepped forward. He introduced himself as Silas, the great-grandson of Jedediah. His voice was a low, guttural rasp, his English archaic and difficult to understand. He was not welcoming. He demanded to know why they were there, insisting this was cult land, that they were trespassers. Sarah tried to explain her purpose, mentioning government surveys and official maps, but the words meant nothing to him. He was hostile, evasive, and deeply suspicious. When she asked about the children, about their health and whether they needed a doctor, his face hardened into a mask of fury. He declared they had their own ways, that they needed nothing from her world. During the tense standoff, Sarah's attention was drawn to the confusing family dynamics. A woman who appeared to be in her late 30s was nursing an infant, while a man who looked to be her contemporary called her mother. Another young woman, who couldn't have been more than 18, was addressed as grandmother by a small child. The lines of generation and relation were impossibly blurred. It was a social structure she couldn't comprehend, a web of connections that defied logic. The air was thick with unspoken rules and a palpable sense of fear. Sarah Jenkins left the basin that day with a churning in her stomach. She knew she had stumbled upon something far more disturbing than an unmapped settlement. She had found a secret the desert had kept for more than a century, and she knew she had to bring it into the light. Back in Perth, Sarah's report was met with a mixture of disbelief and bureaucratic inertia. A lost tribe? A cult? It sounded like something out of a pulp novel, but her detailed notes on the visible physical deformities and her insistence on the presence of vulnerable children were impossible to ignore. Reluctantly, the Department of Child Protection and the Western Australian Police agreed to a joint welfare check. A small, specialized team was assembled. It included Constable Frank Miller, a veteran rural officer with decades of experience in the Outback; David Chen, a quiet but perceptive social worker; and Dr. Evelyn Reed, a clinical geneticist from Royal Perth Hospital who volunteered after hearing the initial report. Their arrival, this time in a 4-wheel drive vehicle after a grueling overland journey, was met with the same hostility. Silas Colt stood as a sentinel at the edge of the compound, flanked by 2 of his sons. He forbade them entry. Constable Miller, employing a calm but firm authority, explained that they were there on a legal mandate to check on the welfare of the children. It was a tense negotiation, but the quiet authority of the law, a concept the Colts barely understood, was enough to grant them a grudging, supervised entry. What they saw confirmed Sarah's worst fears, and then exceeded them. While David Chen tried to engage the children, who were shy to the point of being nonverbal, and Miller tried to reason with Silas, Dr. Reed made her own silent, devastating observations. She was a scientist, trained to see patterns in human biology. Here, the patterns screamed at her. She noted multiple cases of craniofacial dysmorphism, including several individuals with the characteristic flattened mid-face and wide-spaced eyes of Apert syndrome, a rare genetic disorder. She saw pronounced spinal curvatures, missing or fused digits, and signs of significant intellectual disability in nearly every member of the community. These were not random afflictions. This was a textbook presentation of autosomal recessive disorders, conditions that manifest with terrifying frequency when close relatives reproduce. She was looking at a living library of genetic collapse. The evidence they gathered was circumstantial but overwhelming. The lack of any records was a critical red flag. These people did not exist in any official capacity. They had no birth certificates, no tax records, no medical histories. They were Australian citizens by birthright, yet they were completely detached from the nation itself. The family's oral history, as relayed by a slightly more talkative woman named Mary, was a confusing loop. She spoke of her mother, who was also her husband's sister. She talked about grandfather Jedediah's law as if it were a holy text. The purity of the blood was everything. The outside was poison. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A young woman named Alara, perhaps 16 or 17 years old, had watched the outsiders with a fearful curiosity that was different from the others' pure hostility. David Chen, the social worker, noticed her drawing patterns in the dirt with a stick, her movements precise and thoughtful. He approached her gently, not with questions, but with a simple offering, a bottle of clean water. She accepted it, her eyes wide. Over several visits, a fragile trust was built. One afternoon, while Silas was distracted, she led David to a secluded corner of the compound, behind a dilapidated shed. She pointed to a small, crudely carved wooden bird hidden in a crevice of a rock wall. Then she whispered the words that would blow the case wide open. "My brother is my father," she said, her voice barely audible. "My mother is my grandmother." This single, horrifying confession gave the authorities the leverage they needed. It was no longer a case of an eccentric, isolated community. It was a situation of systemic, multi-generational child abuse and incest. The scope of the horror was expanding with every new piece of information. Ilara, now understanding that these outsiders represented a potential escape from a life she had begun to question, grew bolder. She told them about the quiet ones. She explained that sometimes babies were born not right. They were small and weak, or had heads that were too big or too small, or had their insides on the outside. These infants, she said, were taken by Silas to the sleeping ground to be with Jedediah. She then led the team to a barren patch of earth on the far side of the basin, a place the others avoided. The ground was dotted with dozens of small, irregular piles of stones, arranged in no particular pattern. It was a secret, unmarked cemetery. A graveyard for the children who were the most tragic victims of the cult covenant. With Ilara's testimony and the discovery of the suspected burial ground, a magistrate issued a warrant for a full-scale forensic investigation and the removal of the children from the compound. The operation was complex and fraught with ethical dilemmas. The team that returned was much larger, including forensic anthropologists, pediatric specialists, and trauma counselors. The scene that unfolded was one of heartbreaking confusion. The Colts could not understand why their family was being torn apart. To them, this was the only way of life they had ever known. Their grief and terror were genuine. But the state's primary responsibility was to the living and the dead. while the surviving family members were carefully transported to a secure medical facility. The forensic team began the painstaking work of excavating the sleeping ground. What they unearthed was a silent testament to a century of suffering. They found the skeletal remains of 62 infants and children. The pathologies present in the tiny bones were shocking, even to seasoned experts. They found skulls with the keyhole shape of anencephaly, where the brain and skull failed to develop. They found skeletons with the fused bones and distorted limbs of severe skeletal dysplasia. It was a catalog of the cruelest tricks recessive genes can play. The quiet ones had not simply gone to sleep. They were the inevitable, agonizing outcome of a genetic bottleneck so tight it had become a death sentence. Simultaneously, the DNA results from the living family members came back from the lab. The geneticist who briefed the investigative team described the findings as unprecedented in modern medical literature. He presented them with a diagram that was supposed to be a family tree, but it looked more like a dense, overlapping web. He explained the concept of consanguinity and the coefficient of inbreeding, a measure of how closely related an individual's parents are. For the general population, this number is effectively 0. For first cousins, it is 6.25%. In the Colt family, the average was over 35%, and for some of the youngest children, it approached 50%, the genetic equivalent of being cloned. Fathers were grandfathers and great-grandfathers. Mothers were aunts and sisters. Ilara's statement was not a confused metaphor. It was a literal, biological fact. Her brother had fathered her, and her mother was the child of her own father. The family line had not just turned in on itself, it had collapsed into a singularity of shared DNA. The final piece of the puzzle was discovered in a rusting metal box beneath the floorboards of Jedediah's original hut. It was his journal. Bound in dried kangaroo hide, its pages were filled with his spidery, fanatical script. It was a terrifying window into the mind of the family's founder. He wrote of divine visions in the desert, of God commanding him to build a new Eden with his own seed. He laid out the rules of procreation as a sacred duty, twisting scripture to justify incest as a form of purification. The world of man is drowned in a tide of filth, he wrote. Here we shall remain an island. Our blood shall be our fortress, pure and strong, a testament to my will. The journal was not the ravings of a madman, but the meticulous, chillingly logical blueprint for everything that had followed. It was the ideological source code for a century of suffering. Confronted with the journal, the DNA results, and the bodies of the children, Silas Colt finally broke his silence. In a long, rambling interview, he did not express remorse, but a profound sense of bewilderment and betrayal. He defended his family's traditions. "This is our way," he repeated over and over. "It is the way of Jedediah. We survived. Is that not what matters?" In his worldview, warped by a lifetime of isolation and indoctrination, he had not been a monster. He had been a patriarch, a leader, a shepherd protecting his flock in the only way he knew how. He could not comprehend the concepts of genetic disease or child abuse. He only understood the covenant. The aftermath of the Colt family's discovery was a maelstrom of legal, medical, and ethical challenges. The official intervention saw all 27 surviving members removed from the basin and placed into state care. For them, the modern world was an alien planet. The hum of a refrigerator, the brightness of an electric light, the sight of a television. These were overwhelming sensory assaults. They had no concept of money, of government, of a world beyond their own family unit. Their psychological trauma was immense. They had lost their home, their culture, and the very structure of their identity, however twisted it had been. The medical evaluations cataloged the full extent of the physical damage. Every single member of the family presented with at least one significant genetic condition. These ranged from congenital heart defects and vision and hearing impairments to severe intellectual disabilities and compromised immune systems. They were a living, breathing case study in the devastating mathematics of inbreeding. The psychological reports were just as grim. The colts suffered from extreme attachment disorders, an inability to form normal social bonds, and a complete lack of understanding of societal norms. The very definition of mother, father, brother, and sister had to be unlearned and retaught, a process that was both confusing and deeply painful. The legal ramifications were a quagmire. How do you prosecute a man like Silas for incest when he is also a victim of the same system? How do you assign culpability in a closed loop where every perpetrator was also a victim? The director of public prosecutions ultimately made the difficult decision to focus on care rather than punishment for the majority of the family. Silas Colt, however, was charged with numerous offenses, including criminal neglect and concealing births. But after extensive psychiatric evaluation, he was found unfit to stand trial. His mind, shaped by a singular toxic ideology, was incapable of participating in his own defense. He was committed to a secure psychiatric facility, where he would live out the remainder of his days, a relic of a forgotten world. The process of integrating the younger colts into society was a long and arduous journey, marked by both small victories and profound setbacks. The children, being more adaptable, fared the best. Placed in specialized foster care, they slowly began to learn and heal. They went to school, made friends, and for the first time in their lives, experienced a world of choice and opportunity. The adults found it much harder. Many were never able to live independently, requiring lifelong care in group homes. They were ghosts of the Outback, forever haunted by the silent, sun-bleached world they had left behind. 20 years have passed since the Colt family was brought into the light. Ilara, the young woman whose courage broke the silence, is now in her late 30s. After years of intensive therapy and education, she has forged a quiet life for herself. She works as a horticulturalist at a botanical garden, finding a peace in the order and logic of the natural world that was absent in her own family. She rarely speaks of her past, but her existence is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. She is a survivor, a fragile bloom that managed to grow in the most poisoned of soil. The Colt family case, as it became known, left an indelible mark. Scientifically, it provided a tragic but invaluable trove of data for geneticists studying the effects of extreme consanguinity. It led to legislative changes in Australia, improving oversight and welfare checks for remote and isolated communities, ensuring that no family could ever again disappear so completely from the national consciousness. It forced a difficult conversation about the line between cultural freedom and fundamental human rights, and the state's duty to protect its most vulnerable, even from themselves. The story of the Colts is a uniquely Australian tragedy, born from the continent's vastness and its unforgiving nature. The same isolation that symbolizes freedom and rugged individualism for some became a cage for them. It was a prison without bars, built from a single man's delusion and reinforced by the silence of the desert. Their legacy is a somber reflection on the darkness that can flourish in the forgotten corners of the world. It is a chilling reminder that purity, when pursued with fanatical zeal, often leads not to divinity, but to decay. And it stands as a permanent, haunting question. In the vast, empty spaces we so often celebrate, Who else might be out there, lost to a world that has forgotten to look for them?